Hello. Hello, police. Yeah, what's the problem, sir? We just drove down our farm track. Yeah. Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it. Yeah. It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. Now, before I start this video, it's important for me to mention that the author does not seek to discredit any previous accounts or versions of events leading up to the gruesome murders. He merely offers an interesting alternative scenario to be considered. Bill decided to walk to Liverpool Street Station. The sky was bright and blue. A fresh breeze blew through the trees as he cut through St James's Park, then along Horse Guards. Bill knew the walk would take an hour, but it would give him some time to think. Sergeant Bill Handley hadn't expected anything like what he'd just experienced. He hadn't the slightest notion how that had all just happened. But he was optimistic. The bit he couldn't work out was the Mr. P character. P had the smell of something more than just regular police, or even special branch. Bill hadn't personally had any direct dealings with the country's darker organisations. However, he knew his former bosses at the regiment had them all the time. The regiment knew all about what they got up to, and their reputation for getting things done was something he had first-hand knowledge of. It hadn't always been plain sailing. Intelligence, they called it. The troopers on the front line had their own opinion on that title. The year before, both of the country's secret intelligence organisations had acquired shiny new headquarters. Bill had seen the stories in the national papers. For supposedly secret services, it had all been very public. One mob got Vauxhall Cross, the other Thames House. They were both obviously very busy. Now with the big red threat off the table, they could be focusing on other things to justify their budgets and existence. Still, Lynn would be pleased. It was a move up for sure. Commuting to London wasn't the worst. And they'd said somewhere in there that he might be working nearer to home, hadn't they? "What do you think of him then, sir?" Peter Brett asked the room. "I think he'll do just fine, Peter. I think he'll probably find it a little bit boring at first until he starts to get into the work." "What do you think, Superintendent?" "I'm sure he'll have no difficulty with the intrusion into people's lives. He is certainly no stranger to doing what his superiors tell him to do, no matter how unpleasant the job might be." There was a general chuckle of laughter around Spenlove's office from the 3 men, as they sipped the single malt he had just poured. Mr. P continued. "He'll have known from his previous life the capabilities of the GCHQ, and we are 10 years on from then. The fact that we are using technology to look at what these bastards on the street are up to won't surprise him. To be honest, I would expect there would have been a fair amount of frustration for him during his time with the Met CID. You know, why we don't do more to tackle these vicious thugs." "No, as you say, sir, I expect it will be the lack of real action he'll struggle with most. But I'm sure once he gets into the operation and starts to see the results the intelligence brings his old mates on the front line, then I'm sure he'll find the role fulfilling. It's not like we can give him a gun, is it? Anyway, I read somewhere most of his regiment's primary role was about intelligence gathering behind enemy lines, so it's not going to be much different in that respect. I mean, alright, he's not crawling about in some war zone, but he's probably going to be glad of that. I reckon breaking down what these bastards are doing and the best time to move on their operations will be very interesting for him, even if he's not out there on the pavement feeling collars. What do you think of him? You worked with him before, Peter." "Well, it was only one operation, a couple of years back. To be honest, if you hadn't shown me the file, I would never have guessed what he'd been up to. He's a bright fellow. His governor liked him, and I've known D.I. Harvey a long time. D.I. Harvey said Bill was a good team player, yet kept himself to himself, if that makes sense. Independent, intelligent, bright, no real vices. Otherwise, nothing really which stood out about the man. I guess on another day he would have been ideal for undercover work. But as we know, that is complicated with these guys. It's the one thing they're all paranoid about, except grasses, and we've had no luck there lately. Problem is, The undercovers have to get so involved, we'd have to nick them as well. All the CID ever nick these days is low-level gophers, who are too scared to roll over on the guys we really want off the street. No, I think the way you're going about it makes sense. Almost wish I was still in. Just to see the look on some of those smug bastards' faces when you throw away the keys would be nice. You forget though, we have nicked a couple of our own guys, Peter, as part of their cover. Shit, yeah. But I don't think Bill would want to do 18 months inside to build a cover story, or snort cocaine and shag tarts to gain entry to these slags' outfits. He's definitely more suited to the watcher role, I'd say. Peter Brett swallowed the last mouthful of the 15-year-old golden liquor, stood, shook the extended hands and left the room. Peter wasn't sorry he was no longer in. He hoped they'd have better luck than he had with Canning Town and the rest of the evil that had spread from the east of London to his home county and beyond. Bill reported to Scotland Yard as agreed a week later. The final week at Romford had been a bit of an anticlimax, or maybe it was just like any other week, and perhaps he'd hoped for more. The guys had taken him for a curry on Sunday night. Now Monday morning his head was a bit foggy from the brandies pushed on him at the end of the meal. Another smart young WPC collected Bill from reception. He was back in Spendlove's office by 9 a.m, a full week on. There was no sign of Mr. P, or the former DCI Brett for that matter. There was, however, a new face. Good morning, Sergeant. All ready to get on board then? This is DCI Nicholas Edwards. He heads up the team you'll be part of. He reports directly to me, but you'll be working out of a satellite office, which Nick will tell you all about shortly, I'm sure. Now, there are a few things to sort out here today, then I guess you'll get right into it, and Nick will introduce you to the rest of his team. DCI Nicholas Edwards stood and offered his hand to Bill. Good to meet you, Sergeant. Not sure how much you know about what we're doing, but it's good to have you on board. Now, we have a room booked along the corridor for a few hours this morning, and a couple of my team will join us, but usually we work out of an office very close to where you are based. Yeah, that was one of my only concerns, as the local boys don't know we are there. That's okay, there's nothing unusual in that, as most of our work is just based on intelligence gathering. However, we would prefer to have our presence remain unknown. The work we are doing is sensitive. Some of the targets are nasty pieces of work, to say the least. Some of the information we gather is, well, shall I say ambiguous. We have to analyse the whole before we can act on a part. Nicholas Edwards was mid-50s, had once probably been athletic, maybe football or rugby. Middle-aged had softened him. His belly spoke of a more than healthy appetite for food and beverage. It wasn't a paunch yet. If he was careful, it wouldn't grow to look too bad. It was just brimming over the belt, and the second chin hadn't made its own space just yet. He had a gentleman's haircut and a smart suit. Only two things let him down: the dodgy-looking pair of shoes, which looked like they'd be more at home on an Egyptian pimp, and his squeaky Scouse accent, which was almost feminine. Bill trotted down the corridor following DCI Edwards. Where are we based then, sir? Gov will do just fine. It was hard to tell the exact tone of the reply Edwards gave Bill, and he hadn't answered the question. Bill followed dutifully, hoping the new Gov wasn't going to be a complete wanker. DCI Edwards showed Bill into a small conference room. There was a projector screen set up one end, and an enlarged mugshot of a character flickered on it. Rather poor quality and grainy, but easily recognisable. Bill thought he recognised the mugshot from files he'd seen at some time, somewhere, but couldn't put a name to the face. As they entered the room, the screen flickered off, and the two characters turned in unison, standing to meet their boss. Sergeant Bill Handley, I'd like to introduce you to one of my DIs, Paul Ellis, and his Sergeant Mike Bale. Bill shook the extended hands in the order of seniority. The DI was bald as a coot and rather red-faced. Could be blood pressure or too much sun. Paul seemed an amiable guy, looked a bit underweight, but wiry and fit. Hard to gauge his exact age, but older than Bill for sure. He had no noticeable accent, not posh, just no accent, probably home counties. Sergeant Bale gripped Bill's hand firmly, a man of equal rank, apparently not bothered about competition from the smile and warmth of his greeting. His accent was easy to place, as was his aftershave. Wales and Marlborough Reds. Bale was short, stocky, and smelt like an ashtray. He had a rather long body and extremely short legs. Bale wouldn't be catching too many villains on foot. Bill laughed quietly in his own head, making sure it didn't spread to his face. Now, Bill, to answer your first question, we operate out of our offices next to Romford Station, so we will keep things brief here this morning. Then after a spot of lunch, you can head out with Paul and Mike to settle in. We have a lot going on, so the extra manpower is greatly appreciated. The sooner you're up to speed, the better. The villains don't rest, so neither do we. The DCI had just answered the question for Bill. Maybe he was going to be an okay governor. Paul, would you like to give Bill some insight in where we are and what we do? Of course, Gov. Bill, you may have heard the names and even come across some of these guys that we're going to talk about. Not one of them doesn't deserve to be pulled off the streets right now and have the bloody key thrown away for what we know they've done, or will do in the future, to satisfy their lust for power and money. They're at the top of their game and control most of the larger criminal activity in the East London and Essex area. Any small-time villains who start to make a name for themselves come up on their radar quicker than they do ours. They then move in. The sensible ones join the growing ranks. The fools, well, you can guess what happens to them. D.I. Ellis was very matter-of-fact in his delivery. No emotion, it was just business. The local boys have had a run at them a few times, but the top dogs are sliding further and further from the front line all the time. So the results they are getting, although they hinder the businesses, they are never going to stop them. It's too deeply ingrained in society, and they are making too much money. They have the best lawyers, know how to play the game, and are starting to think they are above the law. The recreational drugs market is growing all the time. To put it in perspective, all you have to do is look at the sort of money the drink suppliers are making from the pubs and clubs. They are huge multinational organisations worth millions and making millions. Now, the consumption of recreational drugs by the parrying public is growing exponentially. The amount of money they are prepared to spend on the stuff on a night out is more than their budget for booze. So you can see the sort of money that's involved, that's flowing into these guys' pockets, and where it will eventually put them. But I'm sure you've heard all the numbers before, Bill. There was no way Mike Bell was going undercover on the Essex crime scene with that accent, Bill thought as he listened to him. So what is it the unit actually does? The less senior men look towards the boss, DCI Edwards. The offices we are in are just along from the town's main railway station in Atlanta Boulevard. You probably know it, as the street Hollywood's nightclub's in. We have several other similar units opening in East London, but this is the first in Essex. We all liaise with the central team here at the Yard. This Romford office was set up over a year ago. It's conveniently located near to a major BT exchange, so we are hardwired into the GCHQ over in Cheltenham. Bill was still none the wiser as to what he'd signed up for. Things were all starting to sound a little bit far-fetched for him. He liked the job at CID. This might be getting a little weird, but he'd said yes, so he'd have to run with it. He nodded and tried to look interested in all the right places. Back in the day when I was a young man, if I can remember that far back, the Scouser was trying to be funny, but he said nothing, as Nick Edwards continued. They had their covert and sneaky ways of listening to people, but it was a lot more complicated. They relied on placing bugs and hidden microphones, all that sort of spy stuff. Well, it's a lot different now. I'm sure you know, Bill. We can intercept and listen to pretty much anything which is transmitted electronically. The mobile phone has been an absolute godsend to us. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised just how much of a godsend in the coming weeks. What you're about to realise is just exactly what we can do with the cellular technology. This information is covered by what you have signed and therefore not to be discussed outside of the team. The information we are able to obtain is not suitable to be used in normal process of criminal prosecution. It merely enables us to know what is happening, when it's happening, and who is doing it. There really is no longer any need to use undercover officers or informants in the way we used to. Every one of the targets we look at has at the very least one single mobile telephone, and more often than not, several. They think that by changing their mobile devices regularly and using unregistered ones, we are unable to get material that we can use against them in courts. Well, that may be the case, but think of it this way, Bill. The targets carry around with them a receiving microphone and mobile transmitter at all times. They never have one of the things more than a few feet away from them, and even if they didn't, then someone else will surely bring one to the party. The targets have this ridiculous habit of placing them on the table in front of them, and then discussing all their plans, dreams and fantasies directly over the microphones. Honestly, Bill, the mobile telephone is the single greatest contribution to law enforcement this decade, perhaps even this century. We know where the buggers are within a few feet. We know who they're meeting because the other bugger will bring along his electronic tag and listening device. The only drawback, we have so much information to analyse and the courts won't allow us to use the recordings as evidence unless we jump through a million hoops first. But Bill, we don't need to use the material. To be honest, we're all very reluctant to make it public knowledge just what we really have. I mean, the first few prosecutions would be devastating, but the reality is anyone and everyone would soon know about it. Then the phones would all get left at home. We'll be back in the dark ages. The clever thing is to use what we learned from the intelligence gathered, then turn up at the most inappropriate moment for the bad guys and quite literally catch them with their pants down. They'll always wonder how we got so lucky. Was it a grass or someone undercover? Then fear and paranoia sets in to further destabilise their operation. The trick is to just use enough information so that we can bring them down and not make it obvious just how much we know. The balancing act here is that we get stuff which we really do have to let go for the greater good. Unfortunately, it's where it does get a little bit grey sometimes, hence all the stuff you have just signed. You really need to remember now more than ever, we are an elite unit within the British Police. You cannot discuss with old colleagues anything you may hear or see in the coming years while at the branch. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Yes, Gov. The next hour will be spent flicking through various aspects of the operation, then an introduction to some of the characters on our radar. We'll include some of the basic organisational structures of the criminal elements from the East End of London and the Essex area as well. D.I. Paul Ellis had been on the team a year. He had a good overall understanding of who was who, along with some background information on how they got there, apprenticeships served under who, etc. Bill was instantly fascinated at the complexity and size of the operation. The family tree of the who's who of crime was up on the projector screen. There were lots of mid-tier players, or foot soldiers as D.I. Ellis called them. Many had honed their skill sets, becoming violent and dangerous criminals over the years. Some were from the football terraces, mainly Upton Park. There were also a number of wide boy type motor traders and small-time businessmen. The high-ranking players were the ones of most interest to the branch. A few of the names were mildly familiar to Bill Handley, but only from the hearsay occasionally slung around in the CID rooms, although the rumours about a few being extremely ruthless and dangerous were taken seriously. Bill knew that much, at least. Basically, the senior players were in age groups. There were the old hard men and the new generation hard men. Funny how the job didn't seem to go from father to son very often, Bill noted. Perhaps the hard men didn't want their sons to follow in their footsteps. There were some uncles and cousins, a few links by marriage, but the real top heavies were never superseded by their immediate offspring. The top dogs obviously had enough sense to steer their number one heirs into something safer, with hopefully more longevity, both physically and financially career-wise, than being a top London gangster. The overview was extremely broad-ranging with its lists of things attributed to the main players. One had to ask the very obvious question, why weren't they all behind bars already? So you know all about these guys, and they are still out there? An obvious question from Bill. What we know and what we can prove are two very different things. A lot of what we know, and you'll soon understand this, is never going to be usable in a court of law. It's hard evidence of hands-on crime is what we need. The trouble is, the top guys are rarely hands-on these days. And there are plenty of willing foot soldiers to do their bidding. We often get the lower tier guys red-handed, but they are more than happy to keep their mouths shut. And unless they have a pile of previous convictions, the sentences are what they call doable. Some of them even welcome it. It's all part of the process of getting respect and moving up the criminal ladder. They all have friends on the inside, so it's always an easy time for them. The prison guards are well looked after on the outside by the inmates' associates outside, which doesn't take a lot, considering their piss-poor salaries. A few quid here and there, and they'll take in whatever you want. Drugs, mobile phones, you name it. The foot soldiers keep their mouths shut. They earn respect, and they have a roof over them. They are part of the firm. The names of the top boys are theirs to use inside, and they've earned the right by taking it on the chin. The rule of the law, for these guys, is not laid down by us. They have their own code and it's enforced ruthlessly. Punishment, beatings, threats to family and loved ones to keep them all in line. Now some of it is exaggerated, but enough of it's real, and the rumour mill does a good job for the cause. I won't admit it outside of this room, but we all have a bit of grudging respect for some of the names on this screen. Don't get me wrong, there are some real wankers up there as well. but most of them are very capable men. On another day, maybe in another time, the likes of them would have been the reason Britain was once Great Britain. But as we all know, times have changed, and we are now civilised. But you still can't help admire the balls on one or two of them, and they inspire loyalty, a lot more than some of the wankers in this building, but you didn't hear that from me. D.I. Ellis looked at Edwards as he finished up. Edwards kept a deadpan face, but a corner of his eyes creased as he suppressed some humour at the last comment. Paul is right in his assumptions. These guys do inspire loyalty, even if it is misplaced. The biggest problem we face is the amount of money they are now generating for themselves. It is at unprecedented levels compared to that of their predecessors in the 60s, 70s and even 80s. The burgeoning use of recreational drugs and money generated from the club scenes now means they draw their revenues from the mainstream public, who other than their thirst for good times are not career criminals. These guys are being funded by the average kid and more than a few adults in a way which we have never seen before. Historically, these career criminals would have been involved with hijacking, robbery, maybe even a bit of protection come extortion thrown in. They would probably have to be hands-on. Not enough in the back of a post office van to go around more than a half a dozen guys. Nothing to share around a large army of foot soldiers for sure. Then, like most of their contemporaries who had just scored some fast cash, they wouldn't be too hard to spot. Once they started slinging a few quid around the town, we would soon have them fitted up and off the streets. Not now though, I'm afraid. Things have all changed. They have regular and large revenue streams. They give themselves a scrap of legitimacy by setting up security firms and taking a percentage of the club. Then a few sunbed shops, which supposedly take more cash than Tesco's on a Saturday afternoon, to wash up the reddies from the pills and cocaine sold on Friday night. There is almost bugger all that we can do to touch them. We know even with the paltry few quid they pay in tax, they could never support their footballer lifestyles. But that's my own little grievance, and I won't go into that today. Sergeant Bale, would you like to go over how we break the turf down and what Bill will be focusing on out in Romford? Yeah, sure, Gov. Okay, so Bill, you've heard of some of the names on the board. We are really primarily listening to the characters operating in our area, and that is Romford and out towards Southend and anything in between. The old guard in Canning Town are still in play, but the younger guy there is now the real menace. His nickname in here is the usual suspect. He has his older brother and a couple of very loyal and very naughty characters around him, but he is the main one. Make no mistake, he is nobody's fool. He has no vices, except he loves a blonde. He is fitter than a Welsh back row forward. Rumour has it he never sleeps. They say he just sits in a dark room with one eye open, thinking about his next move. During the day he's either in the gym or working. He is tireless and remorseless in his quest for more and more money. He is surveillance savvy, paranoid and lethal. He would be a gentleman if you didn't know about the crawl streak. He is not on our immediate radar, another team are on him, but anything happens in our neighbourhood of any significance and his name will always come up as the usual suspect at the top. Some of the guys we are looking at are or were under manners to him. Although we think the relationship is now stretched. We believe he suspects, but we know for sure, that some of the guys we are looking at fancy they will jog him on one day. We think they are dumb enough to have a go. And to be honest, they are making serious money. And money buys muscle. So maybe they will. But my money would be on him. Let's just hope he doesn't get the ump with them before we've had a chance to nick them. That's real frustrating when you're on someone and they get themselves dead before you can nick them. A real waste of resources, that. Obviously South London has their firms, and they like the country life just as much as the townies, so Kent has a team operating much like us. We share information, there is no silly buggers going on here. We know from our intel that when needs be, these firms will meet and find solutions to problems involving cross-border issues, territory, insults and just silly wankers getting into bother on each other's turf. They are gangsters, but they are commercially driven businessmen as well. We sometimes can't work out what comes first, but if they cooperate across the territorial divides and we can't, then you know who's going to win. This information comes down from above. It's filtered by the gods above us, and so we get what's happening on our turf primarily. But Bill, this lot have got themselves extremely well organised, and they travel. Most of them pitch up in Marbella for the summer. They are more about making money, I reckon, than anything else, but don't get me wrong, if there is a move on their patch, they react ruthlessly. But more often than not, they find accommodations before it gets too bad. So to deal with this threat, we have to look at the whole, if we are ever going to unravel them, especially with the way the courts tie our hands. Then obviously you've heard of the B team over in North London. They are also a real handful. Fortunately, they have their eyes on other prizes. From the intel we are getting, as long as no one from our manor pisses them off, we are unlikely to come across them on our current assignments. The West End and City teams are on them big time at the moment, along with Revenue and Customs. Unfortunately, those wankers are not team players, and more often than not fuck things up, before we ever get close to a decent collar. Right, shall we break for some lunch? You've been listening to the book Once Upon a Time in Essex. This book is available to purchase online at Amazon and other online book retailers. Many thanks for joining me for this video. Very shortly you'll be able to see some other videos from the channel, including the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the videos concerning this case in one convenient folder. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I look forward to seeing you all again in the next video. Take care. Cheers.